Sarah Mitchell thought she had buried her past 17 years ago, along with her parents, in that rain-soaked cemetery in Ohio. As a nurse at Metro General Hospital, she had built a life of predictable routines and controlled chaos, the kind of organized emergency that she could handle with steady hands and a clear mind. But on this ordinary Tuesday night, when a homeless man was wheeled into her ER and whispered her full name, birthday, and secrets that no stranger should know, Sarah realized that some ghosts don't stay buried. They come back when you least expect them, carrying truths that will shatter everything you thought you knew about the worst night of your life.
Quick pause. Before we continue, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing.
The fluorescent lights of Metro General's emergency room cast their familiar harsh glow as Sarah Mitchell checked her watch, 11:47 p.m. 5 years to the day since she'd started working night shifts in this sterile sanctuary of controlled chaos. Tonight felt different, though she couldn't pinpoint why. Maybe it was the unusual quiet, only 3 patients in the past 4 hours, all minor cases that had been discharged within the hour. Sarah moved through her routine with practiced precision. At 29, she had perfected the art of emergency nursing. Her colleagues respected her steady hands during crisis situations, her ability to remain calm when others panicked, and her mysterious talent for knowing exactly what needed to be done before the doctors even asked. What they didn't know was that Sarah had learned these skills out of necessity, not choice. When you've lived through your worst nightmare at 12 years old, everything else seems manageable by comparison. She was restocking the supply closet when Dr. Amanda Rodriguez approached, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. Amanda had been Sarah's supervisor for 3 years and had become something of a protective mentor, perhaps sensing that beneath Sarah's professional competence lay something fragile that needed shielding. "Quiet night," Amanda observed, handing Sarah one of the cups. The coffee was bitter and too hot, but Sarah welcomed its familiar burn. It kept her grounded in the present moment, away from the memories that sometimes surfaced during these still hours. "Too quiet," she replied, accepting the warmth between her palms. "Makes me nervous when it's this calm. Usually means something big is coming." She had no idea how prophetic those words would prove to be. The ambulance call came at 11:52 p.m. The radio crackled with the paramedic's voice. "Metro General, we have a male approximately 38 years old, found unconscious near the downtown overpass. Appears to be homeless, showing signs of malnutrition and possible hypothermia. Patient became agitated during transport, refusing medical assistance. ETA 3 minutes. Sarah felt a familiar surge of purpose. This is what she lived for. The moment when someone needed her skills, when she could make a difference between life and death. She had chosen emergency nursing not just as a career, but as a calling. Every patient saved felt like a small redemption, though she could never articulate what exactly she was seeking redemption from. "Room 3 is ready," she called to Amanda, already moving to prepare the necessary equipment. IB bags, warming blankets, basic diagnostic tools. She had done this hundreds of times. What made this case different was the inexplicable tightness in her chest, as if her body was preparing for something her mind couldn't yet comprehend. The automatic doors burst open with her pneumatic hiss, and the paramedics wheeled in a figure that made Sarah's breath catch. The man on the gurney was thin to the point of gauntness, his dark hair matted and streaked with premature gray. His clothes were layers of mismatched fabric that spoke of months, maybe years, spent sleeping rough. But it was his eyes that stopped Sarah mid-step. Even in his agitated state, thrashing weakly against the restraints, his eyes held an intelligence that seemed at odds with the circumstances. More unsettling was the way those eyes immediately found hers across the emergency room and locked on with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Patient gave his name as David Chin. No ID, no insurance information. Kept asking for Metro General specifically, which was strange since City Medical is closer to where we found him. Sarah began her initial assessment, checking vital signs with professional detachment, despite the man's penetrating stare. His pulse was rapid but steady, blood pressure elevated but not critically so. What concerned her more was his obvious malnourishment and the way he seemed to be studying her face with an almost desperate intensity. "David," she said in her most calming voice, "I'm Sarah, and I'm going to take care of you.
Can you tell me how you're feeling?" The reaction was immediate and terrifying. David's entire body went rigid, his eyes widening as if he'd seen a ghost. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but in the relative quiet of the ER, every word was crystal clear. Sarah Mitchell, born October 15th, 1994. The clipboard slipped from Sarah's fingers, clattering against the linoleum floor. Around her, the normal sounds of the emergency room, beeping monitors, hushed conversations, the hum of fluorescent lights, seemed to fade into white noise. How could this stranger know her full name and birthday? Her name tag only showed her first name, and her birthday certainly wasn't public information. "How do you know that?" she managed to ask, her professional composure cracking around the edges. David's cracked lips curved into something that might have been a smile, if not for the profound sadness in his eyes. "You don't remember me, but I've never forgotten you. Not for 17 years. The number hit Sarah like a physical blow. 17 years ago, she was 12 years old. 17 years ago, her life had changed forever on a rain-slicked highway in Ohio, when a semi-truck ran a red light and turned her ordinary family dinner into her worst nightmare. "I don't know what you're talking about," but Sarah's voice lacked conviction. Her hands were shaking now, and she clasped them behind her back to hide the tremor. "Room 3 now," Amanda's voice cut through the tension. Dr. Rodriguez had been watching the interaction with growing concern, and our protective instincts were clearly activated. "Sarah, I need you to step back and let me handle this." But David's gaze never left Sarah's face. "The blue Honda Civic," he said quietly, and Sarah felt the ground shift beneath her feet. No one knew that license plate number. The car had been totaled in the accident, hauled away to a junkyard and destroyed. The police reports from that night were sealed juvenile records. There was no reason, no possible way for this homeless stranger to know such a specific detail from the worst night of her life. Unless he had been there. "Security to the emergency room," Amanda called over the intercom, but her voice seemed to come from very far away. Sarah was staring at David with a mixture of terror and dawning recognition. Not recognition of his face, she was certain she had never seen him before, but recognition of something else that made her 12-year-old self stir uneasily in the depths of her memory. "Please," David whispered, reaching toward her with one restraint-free hand. "I've been looking for you for so long. I need to tell you what really happened that night." Sarah backed toward the door, her nurses trained in warring with a primal instinct to run. This man knew details about the terrible event of her life, details that no one should know. Either he was involved in the accident somehow, or he was dangerously delusional and had somehow accessed information that should have been impossible to obtain. Either possibility terrified her. What David knew about that terrible night would force Sarah to confront a truth she had buried so deeply that she had convinced herself it never existed. But some secrets refuse to stay hidden, especially when they hold the key to healing 2 shattered lives.
Security arrived in the form of 2 large men, who took one look at the situation and moved to either side of David's gurney. Sarah found herself grateful for their presence, even as a part of her, a part she didn't want to examine too closely, was desperately curious about what David Chen had to say. "Ma'am, we can have him moved to the psychiatric wing," the older security guard said to Amanda. "Sounds like he's fixating on your nurse here." "No," Sarah said quickly, surprising herself. "I mean, let's hear what he has to say first. If he was really there that night—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. If he was really there, then everything she thought she knew about the accident might be wrong. Amanda frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Sarah, I don't think this is a good idea. This man could be anyone, a former patient who looked up your information, someone who researched local tragedy cases. People become obsessed with survivors sometimes." But David was shaking his head with increasing agitation. "The rain," he said, his voice growing stronger despite his physical weakness. "It had been raining for 3 days straight. The intersection at Highway 23 and Morrison Road. The semi-truck was carrying automotive parts to the Ford plant. The driver's name was Robert Kowalski, age 47, from Detroit." Each detail hit Sarah like a carefully aimed arrow. These weren't facts that appeared in newspaper articles or public records. These were specific details from police reports and insurance investigations that she had obsessed over during her teenage years, trying to make sense of the senseless. The truck hit your parents' car first. Driver's side impact. Your father died instantly. Your mother? He paused, swallowing hard. Your mother lived for 43 minutes after the paramedics arrived. Stop, Sarah said, whispering, but David pressed on. You were in the back seat, behind your father. The car spun twice before coming to rest against the guardrail. You had a concussion, 3 cracked ribs, and a broken wrist, but you crawled out of the car anyway. The emergency room around him had gone completely silent. Even the monitors seemed to have stopped beeping. Sarah felt like she was falling through time, back to that rain-soaked night when her childhood had ended in twisted metal and broken glass. How? Was all she managed to say. David slowly, carefully sat up on the gurney. The security guards tensed, but he made no threatening moves. Instead, he pulled up his shirt to reveal a network of scars across his chest and abdomen. Old scars, the kind that came from major trauma and multiple surgeries. Because I was in the second car, he said simply. The truck hit your family first, then continued through the intersection and hit my car head-on. I should have died that night. The doctors said it was a miracle that I survived. But it wasn't a miracle, Sarah. It was you. The world tilted sideways. Sarah had to grip the door frame to keep from falling, as 17 years of carefully constructed memories began to crumble. She had always remembered the accident in fragments, waking up in the hospital, being told her parents were gone, the long months of recovery with her aunt and uncle. But there had always been gaps, missing pieces that she had attributed to the trauma and concussion. I don't understand, she said, though part of her was beginning to. After you crawled out of your car, you didn't just wait for help. You walked to my car. I was conscious, but barely. Massive internal bleeding, collapsed lung, skull fracture. I was dying, Sarah. I could feel myself slipping away. He paused, and for the first time since arriving, his eyes filled with tears. You sat with me in the rain. You held my hand and kept talking to me. You told me your name, said you were 12 years old, that you lived on Maple Street and had a cat named Whiskers. You talked about school and your friends, and how your mom made the best chocolate chip cookies in Ohio. Sarah's legs gave out, and she sank into a nearby chair. Fragmented images were surfacing now. Rain on her face, the smell of gasoline and hot metal, blood on her hands that hadn't been her own, a stranger's voice asking her to keep talking, to not let him fall asleep. You stayed with me until the paramedics got me out of the car, David said softly. 15 minutes that felt like 15 hours. The EMTs had to physically pull you away so they could work on me. You kept saying, please don't die, please don't die. Those were the last words I heard before they put me under. I don't remember, Sarah lied, because she was beginning to remember, and the memories were overwhelming. The brain injury from the accident affected my short-term memory, David explained. I couldn't work, couldn't maintain relationships, couldn't even remember to pay bills or buy groceries. I lost everything, my job, my apartment, my fiancé. I've been homeless for 8 years. But I never forgot that night. I never forgot you. Amanda stepped forward, her protective instincts fully activated. This is enough. Sarah, you don't have to listen to this. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to— There's more, David interrupted, looking directly at Sarah with desperate urgency. About your parents, about why they swerved into the truck's path instead of trying to avoid the accident. Sarah's blood went cold. The official report had said her father lost control on the wet pavement. No one had ever suggested it was intentional. The accident investigation report, David said, his voice growing stronger. I spent years reading it, trying to understand what happened. The truck driver had been experiencing chest pains for weeks before the accident. He knew he was having cardiac episodes, but he kept working anyway because he was afraid of losing his commercial driving license. David paused, gathering strength for what came next. Your father saw the truck coming, saw that the driver was unconscious from a heart attack. In those last few seconds, he had a choice: swerve right and avoid the collision entirely, or swerve left into the truck's path. Why would he choose to be hit? Amanda asked, drawn into the story despite her professional reserve. Because if he had swerved right, the truck would have continued straight through the red light,
straight into the gas station on the corner where 12 people were buying gas and snacks on a Friday night. 3 families with young children. Sarah felt like she was drowning. Her parents hadn't been victims of a random accident. They had made a conscious choice to sacrifice themselves to save strangers. Your father positioned his car to absorb the truck's impact and slow it down before it reached the gas station. David continued, the police estimated that his actions saved at least a dozen lives. Your parents died as heroes, Sarah. They saw what was about to happen and chose to save others instead of themselves. The chair creaked as Sarah gripped its arms hard enough to leave marks. Everything she had believed about that night was crumbling, being replaced by a truth that was both more terrible and more beautiful than she had ever imagined. But as Sarah processed this revelation, David's next words would shatter her understanding of that night completely.
The silence that followed David's revelation was deafening. Sarah sat motionless in her chair, 17 years of carefully constructed emotional walls crumbling around her. She had built her entire adult life on the foundation of survivor's guilt, the crushing weight of being the one who walked away when her parents didn't. Every career choice, every relationship that had failed because she couldn't fully commit, every night shift she worked to avoid her own thoughts, all of it had been shaped by the belief that she was somehow undeserving of the life she had been allowed to keep. Now David Chen was telling her that her parents hadn't just died. They had died as heroes, making a split-second decision to save innocent strangers. And she had played a role in that night that went far beyond simply surviving. "I need to know everything," Sarah said quietly, her voice steadier than she felt. "If you were there, if you saw what happened, I need to know all of it." Amanda moved closer, clearly concerned about the emotional toll this conversation was taking on her colleague. "Sarah, maybe we should—" "No," Sarah interrupted firmly. "I've spent 17 years with pieces missing from that night. If David can fill in those gaps, I need to hear it." David nodded slowly, as if he had been waiting years for someone to ask him to tell the complete truth. "The truck hit your parents' car at 8:47 p.m. I was about 50 yards behind them, driving home from my engagement party. I saw the whole thing happen." He closed his eyes, accessing memories that were apparently crystal clear despite his other cognitive issues. "Your father had maybe 3 seconds to react when he saw the truck running the red light. I watched him look to the right, toward the escape route that would have saved your family. Then I saw him look toward the gas station, saw him realize what would happen if the truck continued through the intersection." Sarah felt sick. The idea that her father had consciously chosen their deaths to save others was almost too much to process. He turned the wheel left, deliberately put his car in the truck's path. The impact was devastating, but it worked. The truck's momentum was absorbed by the collision, and it came to a stop about 20 feet from the gas station. "And then?" Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. "Then my car hit the truck. I was following too close, couldn't stop in time on the wet pavement. The truck had jackknifed after hitting your parents, and I slammed into the trailer at about 40 miles per hour." David's hands were shaking now, and Sarah realized that telling the story was as difficult for him as hearing it was for her. But she needed to know everything. "I was trapped in my car, bleeding internally, probably dying. The paramedics were working on your parents first, as they should have been anyway. Your injuries were serious but not life-threatening, so you weren't their priority. That's when you came to me." The memory was coming back to Sarah now in vivid, terrible detail. The sound of twisted metal, the smell of gasoline and blood, the weight of her own injuries forgotten in the face of someone else's greater need. "You are so small," David said, tears flowing freely now. "Just a little girl in a torn dress and a pink windbreaker, covered in blood that wasn't yours. But you saw me trapped in my car and you didn't hesitate." Sarah remembered now, the pink windbreaker that had been her favorite jacket, the one her aunt had thrown away because it was ruined beyond repair. She had cried for days over that jacket, but not because of its sentimental value, but because it represented the last tangible connection to her actions that night. I tried to tell you to get away, to wait for the paramedics, but you wouldn't listen. You crawled through the broken passenger window and sat with me. Your wrist was broken. Your ribs were cracked. You had a concussion, but you were more concerned about a stranger than about your own pain. What did I say? Sarah asked, needing to know exactly what had happened in those crucial minutes. You told me your name and your age. You said you lived on Maple Street with your parents and your cat. You asked me about my family, kept me talking when I wanted to give up. But most importantly, you took off your jacket and pressed it against the worst of my injuries. A 12-year-old girl used her own clothing to try and stop a stranger's bleeding. Sarah was crying now, not from grief, but from a profound sense of completion. She had done something meaningful that night, something that mattered beyond surviving when her parents didn't. The jacket probably saved my life, David said softly. The paramedics told me later that without that pressure on the wound, I would have bled out before they could get me stabilized. Your quick thinking, your willingness to help someone you didn't know, that's what kept me alive. But David wasn't finished with his revelations. His next words hit Sarah with the force of a revelation that would change everything she thought she knew about guilt and redemption. Sarah, there's something else. Something about what your parents said in those last minutes. Sarah looked up through her tears, steeling herself for whatever truth was coming next. I was semi-conscious during the rescue efforts. The paramedics were working on all three of us simultaneously, and I could hear conversations. Your mother, she was alive for almost an hour after the impact. An hour? Sarah gasped. The official report has said her mother died quickly, that she hadn't suffered. She was badly injured, but conscious enough to talk to the paramedics. She kept asking about you, making sure you were okay. But she also saw me, saw that you were helping me. David's voice was filled with wonder. She told the paramedic, "That's my daughter. Look at her helping that man. We raised her right." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her parents' final thoughts had been in pride of their daughter, not regret for their sacrifice. They died knowing that they had raised someone who would risk herself to help a stranger. They saw you choose love over fear in the worst possible circumstances, and it was the last thing that made them happy. Through her tears, Sarah looked at David with new understanding. He wasn't just a homeless man who had disrupted her carefully controlled life. He was living proof that her parents' sacrifice had meaning, that her own actions as a frightened 12-year-old had rippled forward in time to keep someone alive. But there's more, David said, his voice carrying a weight that made both Sarah and Amanda lean closer. Something I've never told anyone because I wasn't sure anyone would believe me. What is it? Sarah asked, trying to bring herself to whatever truth was coming next.
After the paramedics got me stabilized, after they had loaded your parents into the ambulances, you came back to me one more time. I was on a stretcher, about to be loaded into my own ambulance, when you broke away from the EMT who was treating your injuries. David's eyes were locked on Sarah's face as he continued. You grabbed my hand and you said something that I've carried with me for 17 years. Something that kept me alive through the worst moments of homelessness and despair. What did I say? I promise you're going to be okay. I promise this won't be the end of your story. David's voice was barely a whisper now. A 12-year-old girl who had just lost everything made me a promise that somehow everything would work out. And you know what, Sarah? You were right. The emergency room around them had become completely still. Even the sounds of the hospital seemed muted as the full weight of that night's events settled over everyone present. Sarah realized that she and David were connected, not just by trauma, but by a promise she had made as a child, a promise that had sustained him through nearly 2 decades of suffering. I tried to kill myself 6 times in the years after the accident, David admitted, his emotional control finally breaking completely. Every time I got close to giving up, I would remember that promise. I would remember a little girl who had just lost her parents, but still cared enough about a stranger to promise him a future. Sarah was sobbing openly now, but underneath the grief was something else, a profound sense of purpose that she had been missing for 17 years. She hadn't just survived that night randomly. She had survived because she had a role to play, a promise to keep, a life to help rebuild. You've been looking for me to say thank you, but I need to thank you. You've been carrying the memory of the best version of myself, the person I was before fear and guilt convinced me to stop taking risks on other people. David reached out his hand, and Sarah took it without hesitation. It was the same hand she had held in the rain 17 years ago, older now and marked by hardship, but still connected to hers by a bond forged in tragedy and sustained by hope. "So what happens now?" David asked quietly. Sarah looked at him, then at Amanda, then back at David. For the first time in 17 years, she knew exactly what came next. As Sarah finally understood the full truth about that night, she would have to make a choice that would define not just her future, but David's as well. Because sometimes the greatest act of healing comes not from saving someone's life, but from allowing them to save yours in return.
Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The weight of decision hung in the air between them. Sarah felt as if she stood at a crossroads, with 17 years of careful, controlled living on one side and an uncertain but meaningful future on the other. David watched her with a mixture of hope and terror, clearly understanding that what happened next would determine the trajectory of both their lives. "Amanda," Sarah said quietly, never taking her eyes off David, "what would it take to get him proper care? Real care, not just a bandage and a referral to an overworked social services department." Amanda looked between them with the expression of someone watching a life-changing decision unfold. "Sarah, you need to think about this carefully. What you're considering isn't just a professional obligation. It's a personal commitment that could change everything about your life." "I know," Sarah replied, and she realized that she did know. She understood exactly what she was considering and why. "David, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." David nodded, his grip tightening on her hand. "Do you want to get better? Not just medically stable, but actually better. Do you want to rebuild a life, even if it's different from the one you lost?" The question hung in the air for a long moment. Sarah could see David wrestling with it, and she understood why. Hope was dangerous for someone who had been disappointed as many times as he had. Wanting something meant risking the pain of not getting it. "I don't know if I remember how to want things anymore," David said finally. "But I know I don't want to die on the streets. I know I don't want to waste whatever time I have left feeling sorry for myself." It wasn't a ringing endorsement of recovery, but it was honest. Sarah found herself respecting his candor more than false optimism. "Then we try," she said simply. "We try to rebuild your life, and if it doesn't work, at least we'll have tried." "Sarah," Amanda interrupted gently, "I need you to understand what you're talking about. Brain injuries like David's don't heal quickly or completely. He'll need ongoing medical care, psychiatric support, occupational therapy, housing assistance. The financial cost alone could be enormous." Sarah looked at her mentor and supervisor, this woman who had protected and guided her for 3 years. "Amanda, I have been saving money for 17 years without ever having anything I wanted to spend it on. I drive a 10-year-old car, live in a studio apartment, never take vacations, never buy anything I don't absolutely need. Do you know why?" Amanda waited. "Because I've been afraid to want anything, afraid to invest in anything that could be taken away. But David has been carrying my memory for 17 years, and I've been carrying guilt that doesn't belong to me. Maybe it's time we both let go of what we've been carrying and try carrying something else instead. The security guards were still standing nearby, but their posture had relaxed. Even they seemed to understand that they were witnessing something significant, a moment of human connection that transcended their usual concerns about safety and protocol. "What are you proposing exactly?" Amanda asked. Sarah looked at David, then back at her supervisor. The plan was forming in her mind as she spoke, born from years of professional experience and a newfound sense of purpose. "I'm proposing that I help David get the care he needs to rebuild his life. Medical evaluation, psychiatric treatment, housing, occupational therapy, whatever it takes. I'll pay for what insurance doesn't cover, and I'll provide the consistency he needs to navigate the system." "That's not a small commitment," Amanda warned. "Brain injury recovery can take years, and there are no guarantees about outcomes." "I understand that. But Amanda, I've been living half a life for 17 years. I chose nursing because I wanted to help people, but I've been so careful about not getting too involved, not caring too much about individual patients. What kind of nurse does that make me? What kind of person?" David was staring at her with something approaching awe. "Sarah, you don't owe me anything. What you did that night, you were just a child trying to help. You don't have to sacrifice your future to make up for surviving when your parents didn't." "I'm not sacrificing my future," Sarah said firmly. "I'm finally starting to build one. David, you said I promised you that night that everything would be okay, that it wouldn't be the end of your story. Let me keep that promise." The silence that followed was broken by an unexpected voice. "What would you need from the hospital?" Amanda asked quietly. Sarah looked at her supervisor in surprise. "What?" "If you're serious about this, and I can see that you are, what would you need from Metro General to make it work? Flexible scheduling, leave time for appointments, resources, and referrals?" Sarah felt a surge of gratitude for this woman who had mentored her, who had understood that sometimes the most professional thing a person could do was to act on their humanity. "I'd need to reduce my hours to part-time, at least initially, while we get David stabilized and into appropriate programs. And yes, I'd need flexibility for appointments and advocacy." "That's doable," Amanda said. "What else?" Sarah looked at David, who seemed stunned by the practical direction the conversation had taken. "David, what do you want? If we're going to do this, you need to be part of the planning. What do you need to feel safe trying again?" David was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling to shift from survival mode to thinking about possibilities. Finally, he spoke. "I don't know if I remember how to want things anymore," he said finally. "But I know I don't want to die on the streets. I know I don't want to waste whatever time I have left feeling sorry for myself." It wasn't a ringing endorsement of recovery, but it was honest. Sarah found herself respecting his candor more than false optimism. "Then we try," she said simply. "We try to rebuild your life. And if it doesn't work, at least we'll have tried." "Sarah," Amanda interrupted gently, "I need you to understand what you're talking about. Brain injuries like David's don't heal quickly or completely. He'll need ongoing medical care, psychiatric support, occupational therapy, housing assistance. The financial cost alone could be enormous." "Let me tell you something I learned from nursing. Every patient I ever treated was worth helping, not because of what they might accomplish in the future, but because they were human beings who deserved care in the present moment. You don't have to earn the right to rebuild your life, David. You already earned it by surviving 17 years of hell without giving up completely. Amanda stepped forward, her supervisor voice kicking in. If we're going to do this, we need to do it right. David, you'll need a complete medical evaluation starting tonight. We'll need to document your current condition, get proper psychiatric and neurological assessments, and develop a comprehensive treatment plan.
And housing? David asked hesitantly. There's a transitional housing program specifically for people with brain injuries, Amanda said. It's not luxurious, but it's safe and supervised. They have staff who understand cognitive limitations and can provide support while maintaining independence. Sarah watched David process this information, saw the war between hope and fear playing out across his face. She understood that accepting help was perhaps the most difficult thing he could do, harder even than surviving on the streets had been. I have one condition, David said suddenly. What is it? Sarah asked. I want to work, even if it's just volunteer work, even if it's just a few hours a week. I need to feel like I'm contributing something, not just taking. Sarah smiled, the first genuine smile she had managed in hours. I think that can be arranged. There are programs that help people with disabilities find meaningful work. We'll figure it out. So we're really doing this? David asked, and Sarah could hear the disbelief in his voice. We're really doing this, she confirmed. Amanda cleared her throat. Then let's start with tonight. David, I want you admitted for observation and comprehensive evaluation. Sarah, I want you to go home and think about what you're committing to. Tomorrow, we'll start making the phone calls and setting up the support systems. But Sarah shook her head. I'm not going home. If David's staying, I'm staying. We're in this together now. David's eyes filled with tears again. His emotional regulation was clearly compromised by the brain injury, but Sarah found his openness refreshing after years of professional emotional control. Why? He asked simply. Why are you doing this for someone you barely remember? Sarah considered the question, looking at this broken man who had carried her memory for 17 years, who had survived homelessness and despair because a 12-year-old girl had held his hand in the rain. Because 17 years ago, I made you a promise, and I always keep my promises. As Sarah prepared to completely restructure her life around helping David heal, she had no idea that the greatest challenge wouldn't be his recovery. It would be confronting the person she had become in order to rediscover who she was meant to be. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the doorway of David's transitional housing apartment, watching him attempt to organize his weekly medications. The task required intense concentration, matching pill bottles to a detailed chart, counting out precise dosages, arranging them in a weekly dispenser. His brain injury made even this simple routine challenging, but he was doing it independently without her help. The transformation in both of them had been profound and painful. Those first weeks had shattered every assumption Sarah had made about healing, recovery, and what it meant to truly help another person. David's brain injury was more complex than anyone had initially realized, affecting not just his memory, but his ability to process emotions, regulate his responses to stress, and navigate social situations. Tuesday's pills are in Wednesday's slot, Sarah observed gently. David paused, studied the dispenser, and carefully moved the pills to their correct position. Thank you. I keep making that mistake. It was a small victory, but Sarah had learned to celebrate small victories. 3 months earlier, David couldn't organize his medications at all. The cognitive rehabilitation had been slow and frustrating, with setbacks that sent him into spirals of depression and self-doubt. The first major crisis had come 6 weeks into his recovery. David had been attending occupational therapy sessions designed to help him manage daily living tasks when he suffered a seizure during a session. The episode itself wasn't serious, but it triggered a cascade of psychological trauma that left him convinced he would never be functional enough to live independently. I'm broken, he had told Sarah that night,
sitting in his small apartment, surrounded by the adaptive equipment and memory aids they had carefully arranged. "My brain is damaged and it's never gonna work right. You're wasting your money and your time on someone who can't be fixed." Sarah had learned that the hardest part of helping David wasn't managing his medical care or navigating bureaucratic systems. It was maintaining hope when he couldn't. Her own emotional resilience had been tested in ways she hadn't expected. Watching someone she cared about struggle with basic tasks that most people took for granted was exhausting and heartbreaking. "You're not broken," she had told him that night, though she wasn't sure either of them believed it. "You're learning to work with a brain that functions differently than it used to. That's not the same thing as being broken." The breakthrough had come during a support group meeting for brain injury survivors. David had been reluctant to attend, convinced that sharing his struggles with strangers would only reinforce his sense of being damaged, but Sarah had insisted, and finally he had agreed to try one session. "There's a woman there named Maria," David had told Sarah afterward, and for the first time in weeks there had been something like hope in his voice. "She had a stroke 5 years ago, lost her ability to speak, had to relearn everything. But now she's a peer counselor, helping other stroke survivors." "What did she tell you?" Sarah had asked. "She said recovery isn't about becoming who you were before. It's about discovering who you can become with the limitations you have now." She said some of the most meaningful work she's ever done has happened since her stroke, not despite it, but because of it. That conversation had marked a turning point in David's attitude toward his recovery. Instead of focusing on what he couldn't do, he began exploring what he could do. His long-term memory was intact and remarkably detailed. His emotional sensitivity, while sometimes overwhelming, also gave him profound empathy for others who were struggling. His experience with homelessness and mental health challenges provided insights that could help service providers better understand their clients' needs. "The job interview's tomorrow," Sarah reminded him as he finished organizing his medications. David nodded, but she could see the familiar tension in his shoulders. The position was with the same nonprofit that provided his housing, a part-time role helping intake coordinators understand the experiences of homeless clients. It would be his first paid employment in over 8 years. "What if I have a seizure during the interview? What if I forget what they're asking me? What if they realize I'm not as functional as they thought?" These were the same fears he voiced before every new challenge, and Sarah had learned to address them directly rather than dismissing them. "If you have a seizure, they'll call 911 and make sure you get medical attention. Your seizure disorder is documented and they've been informed about it. If you forget a question, you can ask them to repeat it. That's not unusual in any interview. And David, they already know about your limitations. They're not hiring you despite your brain injury. They're hiring you because your experience gives you insights that someone without a brain injury couldn't provide." The financial cost of David's recovery had been significant, but manageable. Sarah's savings had covered the gap between what Medicaid provided and what David actually needed: upgraded housing, private therapy sessions, transportation to appointments, and countless small necessities that insurance didn't cover. She had also reduced her hospital hours to part-time, which meant less income but more flexibility to support David's recovery process. The personal cost had been higher than she had anticipated. Sarah's carefully controlled life had been completely disrupted. Her rigid schedule was now subject to David's medical appointments and emotional crises. Her emotional walls, built over 17 years of professional detachment, had crumbled under the weight of caring deeply about someone whose recovery was uncertain and nonlinear. "I never thanked you properly," David said suddenly, interrupting her thoughts. "You don't need to thank me." "Yes, I do." David set down his pill organizer and looked at her directly. 6 months ago, I was dying on the streets, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. I had given up on the possibility that life could be anything other than survival and suffering. He paused, gathering his thoughts with the care that every complex communication required for him. "You didn't just save my life, Sarah. You gave me back the possibility of having a life worth living.
But more than that, you showed me what it looks like when someone keeps a promise, even when it's hard, even when there are no guarantees about the outcome. Sarah felt tears threatening, something that happened more frequently now that she had allowed herself to care deeply about individual outcomes. "You kept a promise too," she said. "You promised me that night that you wouldn't give up, that you'd keep fighting to survive. You've kept that promise for 17 years, even when survival meant living on the streets, even when it meant enduring seizures and memory problems and depression." David smiled, an expression that came more easily to him now than it had 6 months ago. "So we both kept our promises." Yes, we did. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on David's apartment door. Sarah opened it to find Maria, the stroke survivor who had become David's mentor and friend through the support group. She was accompanied by a younger woman Sarah didn't recognize. "Maria, this is Jennifer Walsh. She's a social worker at City General and she wanted to meet David." Jennifer stepped forward with the professional friendliness that Sarah recognized from her own healthcare background. "I've heard about David's recovery from Maria, and I wanted to talk to him about a possible opportunity."
What kind of opportunity? David asked, his natural wariness of new situations evident. "We're developing a new program at City General, a peer support initiative for patients who come into our emergency department with mental health crises, substance abuse issues, or homelessness. We need someone who has lived experience with these challenges and can help bridge the gap between clinical care and real understanding." Sarah felt her heart rate increase. This sounded like exactly the kind of meaningful work that David had been hoping for. But it also represented a level of responsibility that would challenge his cognitive limitations. "What would the job involve?" Sarah asked. "Training clinical staff about the realities of homelessness and mental illness, consulting on treatment plans for complex cases, and providing direct peer support to patients who might benefit from talking to someone who has been where they are." David was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Sarah could see him weighing his desire to contribute meaningfully against his fear of failure. "I have a brain injury, memory problems, seizure disorder, emotional regulation issues. Would that disqualify me?" Jennifer smiled. "Actually, it might make you more qualified. Many of our most challenging cases involve people with neurological issues, traumatic brain injuries, or cognitive impairments. Having someone on staff who understands those challenges from the inside could be invaluable." Sarah watched David consider this possibility, saw the war between hope and fear that still played out in his expressions during moments of potential opportunity. "Can I think about it?" David asked. "Of course. But David, I want you to know, Maria has told me about your journey over the past 6 months. What you've accomplished in your recovery is remarkable, and the insights you've gained could help a lot of people who are where you used to be." After Jennifer and Maria left, David sat quietly in his small living room, surrounded by the evidence of his slow but steady progress: medical appointment calendars, therapy worksheets, books on brain injury recovery, and photos from support group events. "What are you thinking?" David asked. "I'm thinking about that night 17 years ago, about how you didn't hesitate to help a stranger, even though you were hurt and scared yourself. And I'm thinking about how helping me seems to have helped you, too." Sarah looked at him curiously. "What do you mean?" "When I first met you 6 months ago, you were like a ghost of yourself. Professional, competent, but not really alive. Now look at you. You're taking risks, making emotional investments, allowing yourself to care about uncertain outcomes. You're living your life instead of just managing it." Sarah realized he was right. In helping David rebuild his identity, she had been forced to examine her own. The careful, controlled existence she had maintained for 17 years had given way to something messier but more meaningful. "So, what do you think about the job opportunity?" she asked. David was quiet for another moment, then looked at her with something that might have been determination. "I think," he said slowly, "that a 12-year-old girl once promised me that everything would be okay, that my story wasn't over. Maybe it's time I started helping other people believe the same thing about their stories." As David prepared to take the biggest risk of his recovery, both he and Sarah were about to discover
that the final test of healing isn't whether you can rebuild your old life. It's whether you have the courage to build a completely new one.
1 year after David Chen had been wheeled into Metro General's emergency room, Sarah stood in that same hospital, but in a different wing entirely. She watched through a conference room window as David spoke to a group of medical residents about the realities of homelessness and brain injury. His presentation was careful and methodical, accommodating his cognitive limitations, but his message was powerful and clear. When someone comes into your ER who smells bad, who seems confused or agitated, who can't remember basic information about themselves, David was saying, your first instinct might be to get them stable and get them out as quickly as possible. But I want you to consider that person might be someone like me, someone whose brain doesn't work the way it used to, but who is still a human being with a story worth hearing. The transformation in David had been remarkable, though not in the ways Sarah had initially imagined. He would never fully recover from his brain injury. The neurological damage was permanent. But he had learned to work within his limitations, to use his intact long-term memory and hard-won wisdom to help others navigate systems that often failed people like him. The job at City General had started slowly. 3 months of training, shadowing experienced staff, learning to navigate the complex dynamics between clinical care and human services. David's first few weeks had been challenging. He'd had 2 seizures at work, several episodes of overwhelming anxiety, and moments when his memory problems made him feel inadequate compared to his colleagues. But gradually he had found his rhythm. His unique perspective proved invaluable in ways no one had anticipated. He could spot signs of cognitive impairment that others missed, could communicate with confused or frightened patients in ways that put them at ease, and could advocate for services and accommodations that made real differences in people's lives. 6 months ago, we had a patient come in, a woman in her 50s who seemed to be having a psychotic episode. She was agitated, couldn't answer basic questions, kept insisting that people were following her. The initial assessment was psychiatric emergency, possible involuntary commitment. Sarah knew this story. David had told it to her with pride and amazement at his own ability to make a difference. But I recognized something that clinical staff missed. Her confusion patterns, the way she couldn't remember recent events, but could recall details from years ago, it looked like brain injury, not psychosis. We did a CT scan and found evidence of an old head trauma, probably from domestic violence. Instead of psychiatric commitment, she got connected with neurology and social services. She's now in appropriate housing with brain injury support services. Sarah felt a familiar swell of pride watching David tell this story. He had found his calling in the intersection of his own experience and his desire to help others. The work was demanding and sometimes overwhelming for someone with his limitations, but it was also deeply meaningful in ways that his pre-accident career had never been. The personal cost to Sarah had been significant, but worthwhile. Her savings account was much smaller than it had been a year ago, but her life was infinitely richer. She had returned to full-time nursing, but with a different perspective on patient care. David's influence had taught her to see beyond diagnoses to the whole person, to advocate more aggressively for patients who couldn't advocate for themselves. More importantly, she had learned to live with uncertainty, to invest emotionally in outcomes she couldn't control, to find meaning in the process of caring rather than just in successful results. The most important thing I can tell you, David was concluding his presentation, is that every patient you see has survived something to get to your emergency room. Some of us have survived trauma, some have survived systems that failed us, some have survived our own brains turning against us. But we're all survivors, and we all deserve to be treated with dignity and hope. The applause was genuine and sustained. Sarah watched the residents' faces and saw recognition, understanding, and perhaps most importantly, changed perspectives about the patients they would encounter. After the presentation, David joined Sarah in the hallway. His face was flushed with exhaustion. Public speaking still required enormous energy for him, but he was smiling. "How did I do?" he asked. "You were brilliant," Sarah said, and she meant it. "I think you changed some minds in there." "I hope so." David paused, looking around the hospital that had become his workplace. "Sarah, I need to tell you something." She felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the same sensation she had experienced that first night when David had begun revealing impossible truths. "What is it?" "Dr. Martinez got my latest test results back yesterday."
Dr. Martinez was the neurologist who had been overseeing David's care since the beginning. Sarah knew that he received regular cognitive assessments to track the progression of his brain injury. "The good news," David said, "is that my cognitive function has stabilized. The therapy and medication have been more effective than anyone predicted. My memory problems aren't getting worse." Sarah felt relief flood through her. One of her persistent fears had been that David's improvements might be temporary, that his brain injury would continue to progress despite their efforts. "That's wonderful news," she said. "What's the bad news?" David smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. "There is no bad news medically speaking, but Dr. Martinez said something that got me thinking. He said that my recovery has been so successful that I probably don't need the same level of support I've been receiving. I could transition to independent living, manage my own care, rely less on the safety net we've built." Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions: pride in David's progress, joy at his increasing independence, and something that might have been fear of being left behind. "That's what we've been working toward. Independence was always the goal." "I know. But Sarah, I need you to understand something. My recovery has been successful not just because of medical treatment or therapy or housing assistance. It's been successful because for the first time in 17 years, I've had someone who cared about the outcome. Someone who was invested in my well-being not as a professional obligation, but as a personal commitment."
He paused, gathering his thoughts with the care that every complex communication still required. "I don't need you to take care of me anymore," he continued. "But I hope I'll always be someone you care about. I hope we can remain in each other's lives, not because I need rescuing, but because we've become family." Sarah felt tears threatening, something that still happened more frequently since she had allowed herself to care deeply about individual outcomes. "David," she said, "you were never a project to be completed. You were never someone I was helping temporarily until you could get back to your real life. You are my real life. You've been part of my real life since I was 12 years old, even when I didn't remember it." The truth of those words surprised her as she spoke them. David hadn't been an interruption to her carefully controlled existence. He had been the key to understanding what her existence could become. "So what happens now?" David asked. Sarah looked at him, this man who had carried her memory for 17 years, who had survived homelessness and brain injury and despair, who had transformed his suffering into a calling to help others. She thought about the 12-year-old girl who had held a stranger's hand in the rain, who had made a promise without understanding its full implications. "Now we keep our promises," she said. "You promised me you'd keep fighting, that you wouldn't give up on having a meaningful life. I promised you that everything would be okay, that your story wasn't over." She paused, looking around the hospital where they had first reconnected, where David now worked helping others who arrived broken and frightened. "I think we've both kept our promises," she said. "But I don't think our story is over yet. I think maybe it's just beginning." David reached out and took her hand, the same hand he had held in the rain 17 years ago, the same hand she had extended in comfort to a dying stranger. Their connection had been forged in trauma, but sustained by love, damaged by time and circumstance, but ultimately strengthened by their choice to honor the bond they created in their darkest moments. "Thank you," David said simply. "For what?" "For seeing me when I couldn't see myself. For keeping a promise you didn't even remember making. For showing me that sometimes the people who save us are the ones who need saving too." Sarah squeezed her hand and smiled, finally understanding what her parents had known in their last moments, that some acts of love are worth performing regardless of their duration, that the meaning of a life isn't measured in its length but in its impact on others, and that sometimes the greatest healing comes from accepting that nothing lasts forever, but everything matters while it's here. "We saved each other," she said simply, echoing words David had spoken months ago. And maybe that's what we were always supposed to do. In a world that often measures worth by permanence and success by individual achievement, Sarah and David's story reminds us that the most profound healing happens in relationship, through the choice to show up for another person's pain, to invest in uncertain outcomes, and to honor the connections that trauma can create. Their journey proves that ordinary people can indeed have extraordinary impact, not through grand gestures, but through the daily choice to keep promises made in moments of crisis. Sometimes the greatest act of love is simply refusing to let someone face their struggles alone. And sometimes the person who most needs saving is the one doing the rescuing. Every life we touch, every hand we hold, every promise we keep ripples forward in ways we may never fully understand, creating circles of healing that can span decades and transform not just individual lives, but our understanding of what it means to be human. The end.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.